"You're about to laugh at the wrong man," the elderly security guard whispered under his breath as the worn-out father stepped through the revolving doors. But no one heard him over the buzz of morning conversations and the clicking of polished dress shoes across the marble floor. Ethan Walker adjusted the faded strap of the backpack resting on one shoulder and glanced at the folded application in his hand one last time before approaching the reception desk. His denim jacket had been washed so many times that its original color had almost disappeared, and the calluses on his hands spoke of years spent fixing whatever life placed in front of him. Behind the desk, two recruiters exchanged a quick glance before one of them forced a polite corporate smile. "You're here for building maintenance?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Janitor position, if it's still available." She looked him up and down, typed a few notes into her computer, and slid a visitor badge across the counter. "Take the elevator to the 18th floor. Human Resources is waiting." Ethan thanked her with the quiet sincerity of someone who never believed kindness should depend on circumstance. As he walked away, another recruiter leaned closer and whispered just loudly enough for nearby employees to hear. "Kind of overqualified for pushing a mop, don't you think?" The other chuckled. Or maybe life finally caught up with him. Neither noticed Ethan's shoulders remained perfectly steady. He had heard worse. Much worse. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, carrying him toward the executive offices where glass walls reflected the bright Chicago skyline, stretching toward Lake Michigan under a pale autumn sun. He caught his own reflection for only a moment before lowering his eyes. Somewhere across town, his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, was beginning another day at school, believing her father would come home with good news because she still believed impossible things happened to good people. Ethan intended to protect that belief for as long as he could. The Human Resources waiting area buzzed with confident applicants dressed in tailored suits and expensive watches. Conversations drifted through the room about stock options, management experience, and six-figure salaries. Ethan quietly chose the only empty chair near the window and rested his backpack beside his boots. Several applicants looked at him with puzzled expressions before returning to their phones. One man finally smiled with thinly disguised amusement. "Maintenance interviews are downstairs, buddy." Ethan simply answered, "They told me to wait here." The room fell quiet for only a second before low laughter returned. At that exact moment, the elevator doors opened again. Claire Montgomery stepped out surrounded by senior executives discussing acquisition numbers worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Every conversation stopped as employees straightened their posture. The Billionaire CEO walked with calm confidence, acknowledging greetings with effortless grace until her eyes drifted toward the waiting area. She wasn't looking for anyone. She almost kept walking. Then she saw the application folder resting on Ethan's lap. Her eyes caught a single line printed in bold black letters. "Ethan Walker." Her footsteps stopped so suddenly that one executive nearly walked into her. The coffee cup in her hand slipped slightly as color drained from her face. She stared at the name as though it had traveled through time itself. The hallway grew strangely still. Finally, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she said, "That can't possibly be him." Claire Montgomery did not move for several long seconds. The executives surrounding her continued speaking about quarterly projections and international expansion until they realized their chief executive officer was no longer listening. She kept her eyes fixed on the name resting inside the application folder across the waiting room. Her thoughts suddenly pulled somewhere far beyond glass offices and financial reports. One vice president cleared his throat gently. "Ms. Montgomery, the board meeting begins in 8 minutes. She blinked once, almost as if waking from a distant memory. "Delay it by 15. The executives exchanged confused glances. Board meetings worth billions of dollars did not move for anyone. Yet no one questioned her decision. Claire quietly handed her coffee to an assistant without taking her eyes off Ethan. "Bring me every document Human Resources has on that applicant." Immediately. "The maintenance applicant?" the assistant asked carefully. "Yes." "Is there a problem?" Claire answered with unusual calm. "I do not know yet." Across the room, Ethan remained unaware that every plan for the morning had quietly changed. He unfolded a small photograph from his wallet. Lily stood beside an old swing set wearing a backpack nearly half her size, smiling with the fearless confidence only children seemed able to keep. On the back she had written in blue marker, Good luck, Daddy. I know they will see how kind you are. Ethan smiled softly before placing the picture back inside his wallet. Kindness had become the only thing life had never managed to take from him. A young recruiter stepped into the waiting area, holding a clipboard. Mr. Walker? Ethan stood immediately. That is me. She looked surprised by his polite tone. Please come with me. As they walked through bright hallways lined with framed innovation awards and magazine covers celebrating the company's remarkable success, employees glanced toward Ethan without hiding their curiosity. Some assumed he was a contractor. Others believed he had taken the wrong elevator. One engineer quietly joked, I have never seen someone wear work boots to an interview on the executive floor. A few people laughed before returning to their conversations. Ethan never reacted. Years earlier those comments might have stung. Now they simply drifted past him like autumn leaves carried by the wind. The interview room was modest compared to the rest of the building. Sunlight filtered through wide windows overlooking the Chicago River, while a fresh pot of coffee filled the air with warmth. The recruiter invited Ethan to take a seat before opening his application. She scanned the page, then frowned slightly. You have not listed much employment history for the last decade. Ethan answered honestly. Mostly temporary work. Construction. Repairs. Warehouse shifts. Whatever allowed me to be home when my daughter needed me. You have a college degree? Yes. Engineering. That is correct. She looked puzzled. Then why apply to clean office buildings? Ethan folded his hands calmly. Because honest work is never beneath anyone. And this position includes health insurance. The recruiter stopped writing. For a brief moment the corporate script she had memorized disappeared. She noticed there was no bitterness in his voice. No embarrassment, only quiet dignity. Before she could ask another question, her computer chimed with an internal message marked urgent. She opened it, read only 2 sentences, and her expression changed instantly. Looking back at Ethan with growing uncertainty, she said softly, Mr. Walker, the chief executive officer has requested to interview you personally. The recruiter stared at the message for another moment as though she expected the words to disappear. They did not. She slowly closed the laptop and offered Ethan an uncertain smile. Please follow me, Mr. Walker. Her voice had become noticeably more respectful, and Ethan sensed the change without understanding its cause. He simply nodded and rose from his chair, lifting his worn backpack from the floor before following her through a private hallway that very few employees ever entered. The atmosphere changed with every step. The cheerful conversations from the open offices faded behind them, replaced by the quiet hum of climate control and the distant ticking of an elegant wall clock. Framed photographs lined the corridor, each capturing milestones in Montgomery Technology's remarkable rise from a small startup into one of America's fastest-growing innovation companies. Ethan glanced at them politely, but never slowed his pace. Success displayed on polished walls had never impressed him as much as quiet integrity shown in ordinary moments. The recruiter finally stopped outside a pair of walnut doors trimmed with brushed steel. She inhaled carefully before knocking twice. A calm voice answered from inside. Please come in. She opened the door and stepped aside. Mr. Walker is here. Claire Montgomery stood beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, shimmering beneath soft afternoon sunlight. The city stretched for miles beyond the glass, but she barely noticed it. Her attention rested entirely on the quiet father standing in the doorway. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan offered the same gentle smile he had given every person that morning. Good morning, ma'am. Claire returned the greeting almost automatically. Please have a seat. Her words carried confidence, yet something beneath them seemed unexpectedly fragile. Ethan sat comfortably without appearing intimidated by the luxurious office. The polished oak desk, modern artwork, and shelves displaying international business awards seemed to matter very little to him. Claire noticed that immediately. Most visitors admired the room before speaking. Ethan looked only at the person in front of him. She walked slowly toward her desk, opened his application once more, and allowed the silence to linger. You have an engineering degree, she finally said. Yes. Yet you are applying for an entry-level custodial position. That is correct. Do you believe you are overqualified? Ethan shook his head gently. No honest job is beneath a parent providing for a child. Claire lowered the file. The answer struck something deep inside her. There was no resentment. No apology. Only quiet conviction. She leaned forward slightly. If another company offered you an engineering position tomorrow, would you leave? Ethan considered the question before answering. Only if it allowed me to keep every promise I made to my daughter. Claire watched his face carefully. Every expression felt strangely familiar, like a melody remembered after many silent years. She changed direction without warning. Have we met before, Mr. Walker? Ethan looked at her for a brief moment, searching his memory with sincere effort. I do not believe so. Claire nodded slowly, although uncertainty remained in her eyes. She opened a drawer and removed a weathered leather notebook that had followed her through every office since the earliest days of her career. Between its pages rested old business cards, handwritten notes, and faded newspaper clippings from more than a decade earlier. One page contained a single handwritten sentence surrounded by careful blue ink. Never forget the name Ethan Walker. Claire quietly closed the notebook before Ethan could see it. Her heartbeat had become impossibly steady, the kind of stillness that arrives only when the truth stands just beyond reach. She looked into his calm blue eyes once more and realized this interview was no longer about hiring a janitor. It had become the beginning of a mystery she had waited 12 years to solve. Claire rested both hands lightly on the edge of her desk while the silence between them grew deeper, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful, as though each passing second carried another unanswered question. Ethan remained patient. He had spent years learning that truth rarely needed to rush. Finally, Claire offered a gentle smile that almost hid the storm behind her eyes. Thank you for coming in today, Mr. Walker. Would you mind waiting a little longer while I review a few things? Ethan stood without hesitation. Of course, ma'am. Take all the time you need. There was no frustration in his voice, no expectation of special treatment. He simply picked up his backpack, thanked her again, and quietly left the office. The heavy walnut door closed with a soft click, leaving Claire alone with a heartbeat that had become impossible to ignore. She immediately reached for the phone on her desk. Margaret, cancel my afternoon appointments. Her assistant sounded surprised. Including the investment committee? Everything. Yes, Ms. Montgomery. Claire ended the call and crossed the office to a hidden cabinet built into the wall behind a collection of awards. She entered a security code, and a steel drawer quietly slid open. Inside were archive folders from the earliest years of Montgomery Technologies, years when the company had operated out of a rented warehouse with more determination than money. She carefully removed a thick binder labeled Foundation Projects. Dust floated through the afternoon sunlight as she opened the first pages. Financial reports, prototype sketches, investor rejection letters, long nights preserved on fading paper. Then another page caught her attention. A newspaper clipping from 12 years earlier showed a much younger Claire standing beside a half-completed technology prototype during a local innovation expo. Across the bottom, someone had handwritten 4 words in blue ink. Ask Ethan about optimization. Claire remembered that day with startling clarity. She had been 24 years old, carrying impossible dreams and barely enough funding to keep the lights on. One software failure had nearly destroyed months of work only hours before investors arrived. Everyone around her had panicked except one quiet engineer visiting another exhibit. He had introduced himself with little more than a handshake and a warm smile before asking a simple question. Would you mind if I looked at it? Less than an hour later, the entire system was running more smoothly than anyone believed possible. When Claire had offered payment, he politely refused. Use the money to hire someone who needs a chance more than I do. Before leaving, he had written several pages of technical notes, wished her good luck, and disappeared into the crowd. She had searched for him afterward, but no business card remained, only one unforgettable name. Ethan Walker. Claire slowly closed her eyes as the memory settled over her like gentle rain after years of drought. It really was you, she whispered into the quiet office. She opened another folder containing the company's earliest software architecture. The annotations looked strangely familiar. Clean handwriting, elegant solutions, simple ideas solving impossible problems. Every page pointed toward the same invisible mentor whose influence had quietly shaped the foundation of everything Montgomery Technologies had become. Yet no employee on the current executive team had ever heard his name. Somehow the man who had helped change her future was now asking for permission to clean her hallways. Claire looked out across the Chicago skyline, where the golden afternoon light reflected from hundreds of windows like scattered pieces of memory, finally finding one another. Somewhere beyond those buildings, life had carried Ethan through roads she could not yet imagine, and for the first time that day, she realized her next question was no longer whether she recognized his name. It was why a man capable of changing destinies had quietly vanished from the world that should have celebrated him. Claire remained standing beside the window long after the memories had settled into place. Success had taught her how to recognize brilliance, but gratitude had taught her something even more valuable. She had never forgotten the stranger who asked for nothing in return. The only thing she had forgotten was how completely life could change a person. She pressed the intercom. "Margaret, would you ask Mr. Walker to return to my office? And please have lunch brought in for 2. There was a brief pause before her assistant answered. "Right away." A few minutes later, Ethan stepped quietly back inside, carrying the same weathered backpack and wearing the same calm expression. He seemed almost surprised to find a table near the window already prepared with sandwiches, fresh fruit, and 2 glasses of iced tea. Claire motioned toward the chair across from her. "I hope you do not mind. It has been a long morning." Ethan smiled politely. "Not at all. Thank you." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment while sunlight stretched across the polished floor. Outside, boats drifted slowly along the Chicago River as office workers hurried through another ordinary afternoon below. Claire noticed Ethan looking toward the skyline rather than the expensive furnishings surrounding them. "Do you come downtown often?" she asked. "Only when work brings me here," he replied. "Most days I stay closer to home." "Where is home?" "Aurora." Claire nodded. "That is quite a commute." Ethan smiled gently. "It is worth it if the job is honest." She studied him carefully before asking another question. "How old is your daughter now?" Ethan looked up, surprised. "She is 8. You mentioned her earlier. She is the reason I get up every morning." Claire could hear absolute certainty in those words. There was no hesitation, no performance, only the quiet confidence of a father who had already decided what mattered most. "What does she enjoy?" Claire asked. Ethan's face softened immediately. "Reading. Drawing. She believes every stray dog deserves a home and every broken toy deserves another chance." He laughed quietly. "Sometimes I think she is teaching me more than I ever taught her." Claire found herself smiling. It had been years since an interview had sounded more like 2 people sharing life than discussing employment. She unfolded a linen napkin before asking gently, "May I ask about your wife?" Ethan lowered his eyes for only a second before answering with peaceful honesty. "She passed away 9 years ago after a long illness. Lily was still very young. Since then it has just been the 2 of us." Claire offered a quiet expression of sympathy. Ethan nodded gratefully, but did not linger on sorrow. She always believed people should leave every room a little better than they found it. "I have tried to live that way ever since." Those words settled over the office with unexpected weight. Claire remembered hearing something remarkably similar years ago from the young engineer who quietly rescued her struggling prototype. She leaned forward. "Mr. Walker, have you ever regretted walking away from engineering?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked through the glass toward the city beyond as sunlight reflected across distant buildings. "There are seasons when life asks you to build machines," he said softly. "And there are seasons when it asks you to build a child into a good human being. I never regretted choosing my daughter." Claire felt her throat tighten. Every answer pulled another thread from the mystery she had carried for 12 years. Yet one question remained larger than all the others. If this gentle father had willingly sacrificed a remarkable career for love and responsibility, then somewhere between those forgotten years and this quiet afternoon, the world had overlooked a man whose greatest achievement had never been his extraordinary mind. It had been the strength to walk away from it without asking anyone to notice. Claire remained quiet after Ethan finished speaking. The room felt different now, less like an executive office and more like a place where 2 very different journeys had unexpectedly crossed again. She slowly reached for the weathered leather notebook resting beside her and turned it toward him. "Would you look at this?" Ethan accepted it carefully, treating it with the same respect he seemed to offer everything placed in his hands. As he opened the cover, his eyes moved across yellowed pages filled with handwritten notes, rough diagrams, and faded reminders from another lifetime. Then he stopped. His fingers rested lightly on a page containing 4 familiar words written in blue ink. Never forget the name Ethan Walker. He looked up with quiet surprise. You kept this? Claire smiled gently. For 12 years. Ethan studied the page again before giving a soft laugh filled with disbelief rather than pride. I honestly forgot writing that. Claire shook her head. I never did. She leaned back in her chair, her voice becoming softer with every sentence. The day before our first investor presentation, our software kept crashing every 12 minutes. Everyone told me the company was finished before it even began. Then a young engineer walked over from another booth, asked if he could help, and refused every dollar I tried to give him. Ethan looked out the window as though searching for a memory carried somewhere across the skyline. I remember the software. It had a timing conflict inside the resource manager. It was not difficult to fix. Claire almost laughed. It nearly destroyed my company. Ethan answered with complete sincerity. Sometimes the biggest problems only need one quiet person willing to look long enough. His words settled into the silence between them. Claire opened another folder from the archives and slid several original design sketches across the table. Do you recognize these? Ethan adjusted his glasses and smiled almost immediately. You actually used the optimization pathway. We still do, Claire replied. Our current platform is built on the foundation you suggested that afternoon. Ethan looked genuinely stunned. I only left a few notes. Those notes became the backbone of everything we built. He slowly closed the folder, almost uncomfortable receiving such praise. You built the company, Claire. I only pointed toward one possible direction. She looked at him with quiet admiration. You always did that, did not you? You never tried to stand in the spotlight. You simply helped people find theirs. Ethan did not answer because he had never considered his actions extraordinary. Before either of them could speak again, a sharp electronic tone echoed through the office. Claire's computer screen suddenly flashed with urgent notifications. Another alert followed. Then another. Her desk phone began ringing almost immediately. She answered. Claire Montgomery speaking. The voice on the other end sounded unusually tense. We have a serious situation. The central operating network is failing across multiple divisions. Engineering cannot stabilize it. Customer services are beginning to lose access. Claire remained composed. How long before full interruption? Our best estimate is less than 20 minutes if we cannot isolate the failure. She thanked the caller and slowly lowered the receiver. Beyond the glass walls, employees who had been calmly walking through the executive floor were now moving with visible urgency. Phones rang continuously. Conference room doors opened and closed in rapid succession. The quiet rhythm of the building had changed into something far more uncertain. Ethan watched the growing activity without speaking. He had seen enough difficult days in life to recognize when people were trying not to panic. Claire looked from the flashing alerts on her monitor to the calm father sitting across from her. Then, almost without realizing she had made the decision, she quietly asked the question that would change both of their lives. Ethan, would you mind taking one look at the system before my engineers make another move? Ethan looked at the flashing alerts for several quiet seconds before meeting Claire's eyes. I should probably warn you, he said with a modest smile. It has been a long time since anyone asked me to solve a problem this complicated. Claire answered without hesitation. Something tells me you have not forgotten how. He stood, adjusted the strap of his backpack, and followed her into the Executive Operations Center. The atmosphere changed the moment the doors opened. Giant display screens covered one wall, each filled with streams of system diagnostics, customer traffic reports, and blinking warning indicators. Engineers hurried from one workstation to another, speaking in calm voices that barely concealed growing concern. Someone noticed Claire entering and quickly approached. We isolated the slowdown twice, but every restart creates another failure somewhere else. We cannot find the root cause. Claire stepped aside and motioned toward Ethan. This is Mr. Walker. I would like him to observe before anyone makes another change. The room became unusually quiet. Several engineers looked at Ethan's faded denim jacket, worn boots, and visitor badge before exchanging puzzled expressions. One senior architect spoke carefully. With respect, Ms. Montgomery, we are dealing with the company's core infrastructure. Claire answered calmly. I am aware. Another engineer rolled his chair back and stood. Does he work in cybersecurity? Ethan smiled politely. No. Cloud systems? No. Software engineering? Ethan paused before answering. Not for many years. The uncertainty in the room deepened. Claire simply pointed toward an empty workstation. Please. Ethan sat down without the slightest trace of self-importance. He rested his fingertips lightly on the keyboard, but did not type immediately. Instead, he watched the screens in complete silence. His eyes moved from one diagnostic window to another while conversations continued behind him. 30 seconds passed. Then another 30. He asked only one question. When did the first warning appear? An analyst answered, exactly 11:43 this morning. Ethan nodded. And what changed 10 minutes before that? Several people began searching through deployment records. One developer replied, a routine resource balancing update. Ethan leaned slightly closer to the monitor. Not routine. The room grew still again. He pointed toward a graph showing processor activity. Look here. The update itself is working exactly as designed. The problem is that another service is still expecting the previous timing sequence. They are politely waiting for one another forever. The engineers stared at the screen. Ethan continued speaking in the same calm voice. It is like two people holding a door open for each other at the same time. Neither person is wrong. They simply never move. One young programmer blinked. That actually explains every symptom. Ethan nodded. Do not replace the update. Let it finish its job. Adjust the synchronization delay by 4 milliseconds inside the legacy scheduler instead. A senior engineer frowned. That scheduler has not been touched in over a decade. Ethan smiled gently. I know. The engineer hesitated before following the suggestion. Fingers moved quickly across keyboards. Commands appeared one after another. The warning indicators remained red for several long moments that felt much longer than they truly were. Then one alert disappeared. Another turned yellow. A third became green. Across the operations center, monitor after monitor returned to normal. Customer service dashboard stabilized. Data traffic flowed smoothly once again. The anxious conversations faded into complete silence. No one cheered. No one spoke. They simply stared at the visitor sitting quietly in front of the workstation as though the room itself had forgotten how to breathe. Ethan stepped away from the keyboard and looked toward Claire with the same humble expression he had worn all morning. You may want someone to document that adjustment, he said softly. Otherwise, another update could create the same problem a few years from now. No one moved for several long seconds. The constant hum of keyboards had stopped. Even the monitors, now glowing with calm green indicators instead of flashing warnings, seemed to illuminate a different room than the one Ethan had entered only minutes before. The senior architect slowly looked from the stabilized dashboards to the quiet father standing beside the workstation. How did you know where to look? He asked almost in disbelief. Ethan shrugged gently. Systems usually tell you what is wrong. You only have to listen before trying to fix them. The answer sounded so simple that several engineers exchanged embarrassed smiles. They had spent nearly an hour fighting the symptoms while the man they had mistaken for an ordinary maintenance applicant had solved the problem by first understanding it. Claire stepped forward, her expression filled with something far deeper than admiration. It was gratitude that had waited 12 years for the chance to speak. She looked around the operations center and addressed everyone in a calm voice. There is something every person in this room deserves to know. Conversations immediately faded. Employees turned away from their screens as executives quietly gathered near the back of the room. Claire continued. Many of you believe this company began with one successful presentation and one determined founder. That is only part of the story. She turned toward Ethan. Long before Montgomery Technologies became a public company, before we had investors, before anyone believed we would survive our first year, a stranger walked into a small technology expo and helped a young entrepreneur whose dream was falling apart. Several older employees listened with growing curiosity. Claire smiled softly at Ethan before continuing. He asked for nothing. He accepted nothing. He simply solved the problem, left detailed notes, wished me good luck, and disappeared. She picked up the archive design folder that Margaret had quietly brought into the operations center only moments earlier. Opening one yellowed page, she held it where everyone could see the handwritten engineering notes. These recommendations became the foundation of the architecture that still supports our company today. The senior architect stepped closer, studying the handwriting with widening eyes. These are the original optimization designs. Claire nodded. Every major platform we have built grew from these principles. A younger software engineer looked back at Ethan in astonishment. You wrote those? Ethan answered with characteristic humility. I only suggested a few ideas. Claire and her team built everything that followed. Claire gently shook her head. You still do it, Ethan. Every time someone praises you, you hand the credit to someone else. The room became perfectly still again. One employee quietly remembered laughing when Ethan first walked through the executive floor. Another remembered assuming he had taken the wrong elevator. The recruiter who had interviewed him lowered her eyes, realizing how quickly appearances had shaped her expectations. Yet Ethan showed no sign of resentment. He smiled at everyone with the same kindness he had offered from the beginning. Claire closed the folder and looked directly at him. For 12 years I wondered what became of the man who quietly changed my future. Ethan folded his hands comfortably. Life became busy. My daughter needed me more than the technology world did. No one laughed. No one questioned that answer. In that moment, every degree hanging on the walls and every award displayed throughout the building seemed smaller than the quiet dignity of the father standing before them. Success had filled the company with remarkable professionals, but humility had just walked into the room wearing worn boots and carrying an old backpack, reminding everyone that the greatest legacy is not measured by titles or wealth, but by the lives quietly lifted along the way. The room remained silent until Claire took one slow step toward Ethan and extended her hand, not as a chief executive officer greeting an applicant, but as one grateful human being honoring another. Ethan accepted the handshake with the same quiet humility that had defined every moment of the day. Claire smiled warmly before turning to everyone gathered in the operations center. I asked Human Resources to schedule an interview for a custodial position this morning, she said. Instead, I was given the opportunity to welcome back someone whose integrity helped build this company before it even had a future. She looked back at Ethan. I cannot offer you the job you came here for. A few employees glanced at one another, confused for only a heartbeat before Claire continued. Because I have a different position in mind. She paused just long enough for every person in the room to listen with complete attention. Ethan Walker, I would be honored if you would become our Senior Director of Systems Innovation and Technical Mentorship. You would have complete flexibility to create your own schedule, every benefit your daughter deserves, and one condition that cannot be negotiated. Ethan smiled with gentle curiosity. What condition is that? Claire answered without hesitation. You must continue being exactly the man you are today, because this company needs your character even more than it needs your knowledge. The words settled over the room like quiet sunlight after a long storm. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before reaching into his wallet and removing Lily's small photograph. He looked at the smiling face of his daughter and remembered the promise he had made that morning before leaving home. He had promised only to come back with hope. Never once had he imagined returning with a future. He carefully slipped the picture back into his wallet before looking at Claire. May I ask one question? Of course, she replied. If I accept, there will be days when my daughter needs me before any meeting or project. Claire smiled. Then every meeting will wait. Companies succeed because of people. Families are the reason people succeed. Ethan's eyes reflected quiet gratitude. In that case, he said softly, I would be honored to help. The operations center filled with warm applause, not loud or theatrical, but sincere. It was the kind of applause reserved for moments that reminded people who they wanted to become. Later that evening, as the autumn sun settled behind the Chicago skyline, Ethan walked out of Montgomery Technologies carrying the same old backpack with which he had arrived that morning. Nothing about his appearance had changed. His boots were still worn. His jacket was still faded. Yet everyone who passed him now greeted him with genuine respect. The security guard near the revolving doors smiled knowingly as Ethan walked by. Looks like they finally laughed at the wrong man, he said with a quiet grin. Ethan chuckled softly. Maybe today, everyone learned something. Outside, he climbed into his aging pickup truck and began the drive home toward Aurora. The golden light reflected across the windshield as peaceful music drifted from the old radio. When he pulled into the driveway, Lily ran onto the front porch before he had even turned off the engine. Daddy, how did it go? She called with hopeful eyes. Ethan knelt beside her and wrapped her in a gentle hug. It went better than I ever expected. She smiled. I told you they would see how kind you are. Ethan looked toward the quiet evening sky and realized she had been right all along. Talent may open a door, success may build a company, and wealth may change a life. But quiet dignity has a way of changing hearts long after applause fades away. Sometimes the greatest names disappear from the world not because they have lost their worth, but because they choose to love someone more than they wish to be remembered. And when the right heart remembers them at last, the world grows a little kinder for everyone.